Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest edition of the Jake's Take with Jacob Elyachar Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Elyachar, the chief content producer and writer of jakestake.com, a pop culture entertainment news website. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, please give us the thumbs up and please subscribe to our channel. And if you're listening to this to any of our audio platforms, give it a 5-star rating and please subscribe and please download. I am thrilled to welcome our very first international guest of 2023. He is a modern comics historian whose specialties include DC and Marvel. And as of this recording, he has over 84,000 YouTube subscribers. So please help me welcome Owen Likes Comics.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. That was such a spirited and kind of encouraging introduction. I feel like I could take on the world. Thank you for having me, Jake. I'm so glad to be here.
Owen, it's such a thrill to watch you. I've been watching your videos for the past couple of months, and you are phenomenal at capturing modern day comics.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I try.
All right, so let's get started. So, when did you get interested in comics, and how did that passion evolve into desire to start your own YouTube channel?
So that's a really good place to start. So I'm gonna try and not just use this as like a opportunity to self-promote myself for an hour or two, but the most recent video I produced on my channel was a very kind of personal and introspective video looking at the first ever comic book series that I really properly got into reading as a child, and how that kind of navigated me not into the world of kind of Marvel and DC, but kind of helped blossom the career and the things I do today. That book being Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley's Ultimate Spider-Man comic from the early 2000s. And so in terms of how I got interested in comics, that's a really good place to start. So I'm a 90s kid. I grew up on the kind of Marvel and DC animated series of that era, Batman the animated series, X-Men, Spider-Man. Those kind of, that generation of cartoons was like my initial gateway into superheroes before reading comics, or they weren't really the same kind of movies that there are today, but whatever kind of was there. My introduction to the worlds of kind of Marvel, DC, and so on came through those cartoons. And then after binge watching every possible rerun of those shows, I found myself on a feverish hunt for more stories and for more kind of opportunities to spend times with these characters. And that kind of coincided with the launch of Ultimate Spider-Man, which in the US came out in 2000. And I think we started getting reprints over in the UK in about 2001, 2002. And I just kind of was in a store and stumbled upon kind of a rack full of magazines and books, and they just happened to have this I remember it to this day. It's the cover, the Joe Quesada cover of the very first issue of Spider-Man swinging, just being in awe of this, and it's like seeing Excalibur just kind of hologramming, projecting above you. So I bought the comic, I rushed home and read it, and it was like something had been activated in my brain. I was just kind of obsessed with this. Not only did I keep reading Ultimate Spider-Man for years and years and years, but then I also picked up loads of other books. I picked up X-Men, I picked up the Avengers, Batman, Superman, so on. And then through that, that 20 years later, here I am talking about comics on the internet. So that answers the first question, or the first part of your question. But in terms of how that evolved into what I do now on Owen Likes Comics, so I it's funny because most of the people you probably speak to who do this kind of thing have some sort of background in TV and film and media, or at least know how to do these things before they start. For me, it was the complete opposite. I actually came from a background of history, but also of music production, of audio engineering. That was kind of my creative background, is kind of producing and working in studios and stuff music wise. And it was kind of I had it was kind of 2015, 2016. I had a couple of personal goings on. I was kind of my personal situations had quite dramatically changed, and I found that I had considerably more free time than I had any time previously in my life, for whatever reason. And at that time, I kind of really started to get into watching YouTube. And this 2015, 2016 is the period in which kind of the video essay kind of stuff really started to take off. Channels like Every Frame a Painting, The Nerd Writer, all started to kind of really break out and become these big, interesting channels. And as someone that comes from an academic background and loves writing and researching, I saw the way that they combined that kind of academic documentarian approach with YouTube to be really interesting. I thought, like, could this be applied to looking at comic books? Because there were a good chunk of channels that covered comics, Comic Historian, Comic Explain, Comic Pop, NerdSync. Were all around kind of long before I was, and still are. But I didn't feel like, as great as those channels were and still are, no one was really kind of taking that academic, historiographical, like really analytical look into the history and the context and the culture behind comics. So I thought, right, well, if no one else is going to do it, I've got nothing better to do. I've got this free time. Why not give it a go? And then over the kind of past 5 or 6 years, it's just kind of, I've got better at what I do. Like I've become a better writer, a better researcher, a better editor. I've read a lot more comics. I thought I knew a lot about comics when I started, but actually doing this for the past kind of half a decade has forced me to read so many more books, and books I never would have probably read otherwise, whether it's kind of people, viewers suggesting books, or me seeing other people cover books that I think sound interesting. It's really opened my kind of my eyes to so many great stories. So that's the very long, short version, I guess.
Absolutely. And I gotta say, I, as a fellow 90s kid as well, I'm definitely blessed that we were grateful to have the people that created like Batman animated series, Spider-Man animated series, X-Men animated series, because those are the gold standards of animation. And then
Absolutely.
I also got through the animated, going to my first comic book shop, but it wasn't, it was the Batman Gotham Adventures, Batman and Robin Adventures. But it wasn't until Hush that I actually started to pick up the adult comics, and then then it went through Uncanny X-Men, and then the X-Men, and then so much, and then also when Brian, we'll get to it, the New Avengers, and then Ultimate Spider-Man. So those stories got me hooked into that, and then then around Infinite Crisis, I took like the build to Infinite Crisis. I became more active with DC, such as having Adventures of Superman, Action Comics, JLA, those stories. So
yeah, absolutely. It's a kind of a similar time frame to me. Like New Avengers was one of my big, like that was the first Avengers book I ever really read. I remember reading Disassembled and not really knowing what was going on, and then New Avengers launched, and then I like the first big like story, like event I ever really read in any comic was House of M. Reading the main book, reading all the tie-ins. So that's a series that always holds a special place in my heart as well.
Absolutely. And House of M didn't really set the standard for that. I think the 2000s really set the standard for event comics. Those with House of M, Civil War, The Death of Captain America, Secret Invasion, Dark Reign. Those stories, I think, really set the tone for the Marvel Universe.
Oh, absolutely. Definitely.
And to be quite frank, I don't think they've ever been replicated.
Yeah, it's like that kind of like 3 or 4 year period of Marvel events is like not only become so much of like what the MCU is built on, but so much of like Marvel's modern day storytelling circles back to those ideas in that time period of like 2004 to like 2007, and DC as well, like that kind of that era of like Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, Morrison's Batman, Superman Birthright is still like, and I certainly rose into glasses because that was the era in which I came into reading DC. But that era still seems like something that both big companies constantly kind of cycle back to take ideas from and influence from.
And to even add to that, Jeff Johns' entire Justice Society America, and of course Green Lantern, which includes Blackest Nights and Brightest Day.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we got to move on and continue our conversation because we'll talk about some of those stories because those are sprinkled into your video. So how long does it take a video from inception to release?
That can very much depend. Right now, at the kind of present moment, the videos are taking a little bit longer than they did at any time before, just because I'm taking on more ambitious projects. I'm trying to push myself not only in terms of researching and writing, but also editing. So the videos right now from start to finish. So the Ultimate Spider-Man video, which is the most recent thing on the channel, that probably from like me starting to properly put the script together to the video going out was about a month. And in that month, that involves me rereading the comics that I'm talking about, making notes, kind of getting a sense of not only kind of the plot and structure of the book, but also kind of the interesting tidbits that I can analyze and pick up on. And then it's researching, so looking for interviews, looking for reviews, looking for any kind of things either by the creators or regarding the creators, talking about maybe the history of how the book came together, what their influences were, those kind of things. Those pieces of information that kind of inform how I present kind of the story of this book. So that's normally like the first like week or so is reading the comics, making notes, kind of putting together an outline, a plan of how I'm going to talk about it, and then seeing how I can kind of supplement that with information from the writers, the artists, the editors, other people that maybe worked at the company at the time, historians that have maybe covered it, and start to kind of put the pieces together of, okay, how did this come from a loose idea that someone came up with to a finished product? So that normally takes the first week or so. And then once that's done, it's just a kind of a case of editing it, of recording. I don't necessarily write the entire script and then edit the entire thing. I tend to kind of take it in chunks. So I put together an introduction, kind of set out where I want to go with the video, record and edit that all together. And then I can kind of get a sense of how the video is shaping up and kind of sculpt it and mold it with each extra kind of chapter and section of the video. So normally it's a kind of couple of weeks. Like I said, I'm doing some other projects at the moment. I'm writing a chapter for a book. I'm working on some other bits of research as well as kind of continuing to make the videos. So it is slightly slower down just because there's less days in the week that I can physically work on it. Well, the video I've started working on a new video this week, which I don't know whether or not I'm ready to reveal what the topic is, but from this point of me kind of starting to write it over the last couple of days, it'll probably be 3 or 4 weeks before it's out. So usually it's about a month, but then there are some videos that take a long time to kind of write. So that Ultimate Spider-Man video, I'd wanted to make a video on that book for years. Pretty much any point over the last 2 years, it has been on my kind of list of talk about this eventually. But then whenever I kind of sat down, came to kind of articulate my thoughts on the book, I never really knew what to say because it's such a, I try when I talk about these comics to be objective, to analyze them, present the facts, the information, and not kind of be too overtly biased either way, positive or negative. I think you can kind of make your opinion yourself of whether or not you like the story. I'm just here to kind of give you all of the interesting information and kind of pick it apart a little bit. But with something like Ultimate Spider-Man, because it is so like connected to my own love of comics, not only is it one of my favorite series of all time, but like it is like the book that really launched me into comics. I really struggled for a long time to think about how to present any sort of analysis of that series objectively, because I couldn't separate myself from the book. So that was a video that took a really, really long time. There were so many different drafts and versions of it. Every few months I'd come back to and see if I could, find the right way to approach it. And I never could until very recently when I realized that the only way I can really make this video is to not separate myself from it, to talk about the video, to talk about the book not only as like this incredible reinvention of Spider-Man's origin for a new generation, but also talk from the perspective of someone who was that generation that was introduced to Spider-Man from that comic and how it shaped my love of superheroes. So as a kind of general rule, I'd say the videos take about a month. Some can be shorter, some can come together really quickly. That's happened before. And then some can take a really long time and can take months, if not years to like properly from idea to execution.
I gotta say that bravo, because to read the entire Bendis's Ultimate Spider-Man for a whole week, that just like properly reading it, not skimming, is just amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So while we're on the subject of Ultimates,
sorry, I couldn't hear what you said then. Just slightly cut off.
Yeah, so I'm so sorry, everyone. What I meant to say is to properly read Ultimate Spider-Man and not skim it from start to finish of Brian Michael Bendis' version, I give you a lot of credits.
Yeah, so I was kind of fortunate with that video where I kind of limited myself to how much Ultimate Spider-Man I would read and talk about. I could have the idea of doing a video on the entire 160 issues is incredibly daunting. That would be like a feature-length documentary. Um, so when it came to making that video, I had to kind of set parameters on which parts of the book I'd cover. And with the idea of me talking about it as my gateway into comics, I thought it would make sense to kind of present it as my origin story, if you will, to kind of put a very cheesy kind of tagline to it. So I thought if I'm doing that, well, I should look at the origin story of Ultimate Spider-Man, which is the first 13 issues. So it's 2 volumes, 13 issues. So that was really what I looked at in the video. So I read all of that. I read all 13 issues. And then a little bit after that as well, just to make sure that there weren't kind of any major plot points in relation to kind of setting up Spider-Man status quo that I'd missed. So I probably read the first 20 or so issues for that video. And yeah,
I
it
gotta
was really
say,
fun to go back and read them.
oh yeah, absolutely. I gotta say, while we're on the subject of Ultimate Spider-Man, one of my favorite videos of yours was your take on the Clone Saga because of all story that could have been one of the biggest flops of all time. But instead, the Ultimate Spider-Man Clone Saga, I think, is not only one of my all-time favorite Spider-Man stories, but also one of Bendis's best stories. Because I'm sorry, I'm going to say spoiler alert, everybody. You have a lot of things going on at once. 4 different clones, including Kane and Scorpion and Doppelganger. You also have the introduction of Spider-Woman. You have Dr. Octopus in one of the greatest, and I gotta say, his glory, great villain. And you finally have Aunt May realizing Peter's secret. You also have
Yeah.
Carnage coming back in the most horrifying twist ever. And not only that, you also have Nick Fury finally seeing the hero Peter Parker it truly is. So those are so many defining moments.
Yeah,
So
the Ultimate Clone Saga is a really interesting one because I think I said it in the video that when it was announced, because Ultimate Spider-Man, this was the big like 100-issue storyline to kind of cap off everything that him and Bagley had done. When Bendis announced that they were going to do the Clone Saga, that was such a huge risk because not only is the Clone Saga like one of the most controversial and polarizing comic stories of all time, and it's kind of one of the things that really like drove a lot of people away from reading Spider-Man. But Bendis and Bagley had been on such a high for like 7 or 8 years. Like Ultimate Spider-Man just never stopped being good. It was just so consistently quality. They were so good at kind of remixing and adapting old Spider-Man stories from the main continuity, but doing them in fresh and unique ways that it never felt predictable. And so when it came out that they were going to tackle the Clone Saga, I think everyone was very trepidatious and very kind of concerned. Okay, that like are Bendis and Bagley kind of getting too overconfident for themselves? We know that they're great, but are they good enough to kind of make the Clone Saga work? No one can do that. It's a mess, and yet I think the Ultimate Clone Saga is, like you said, one of the best things Bendis has ever written. It's a great kind of culmination of the arc of the previous 100 issues of Ultimate Spider-Man. Everything you talked about, from like the return of Carnage to how it uses Doc Ock to Aunt May learning Peter's identity to kind of his the change of his relationship with Nick Fury, and like you said, also the introduction of so many other cool characters. Ultimate Jessica Drew, Spider-Woman, is one of my favorite characters Bendis has ever created. I think it's so criminal. I think she's such an awesome character and such an interesting spin on Peter Parker, and an interesting way to look at the life of Peter Parker through that perspective. But then I think it's so criminal the way Marvel didn't really use that character enough afterwards. So I thought she was just fantastic. And yeah, so that video, that was the first time I'd really dabbled in doing any Ultimate Spider-Man on the channel. I'd done a fair amount of some other Ultimate books, but I'd kind of stayed away from Spider-Man for a long time. And now it feels slightly strange that like I've started doing the first 13 issues now, and I will probably go on and talk about another book from that kind of early run at some point. But then I've already done like the big 100-issue saga a year or two ago. But it was a fun video to do, and I was joined by that with Sal Crivelli from the channel Comic Pop, who not only is like an incredible kind of comics reader and a knowledge of comics. He's a fountain of knowledge, but he's also someone that has been very vocal about being a big Spider-Man reader during the 90s and the Clone Saga driving him away and making him stop read Spider-Man for a long time. He didn't read Spider-Man for several years because of how much he was frustrated by the original 90s Clone Saga. And so I look at the Ultimate Clone Saga as just a really I read the Ultimate Clone Saga before I'd read the original Clone Saga. So I have a very different perspective on it than Sal would, who remembers the original Clone Saga when it happened and hating it so much. To him, but to me, the Ultimate Clone Saga is a victory of kind of this big celebration of Ultimate Spider-Man at 100 issues and how well it was. And it could even take, and in my perspective, it being kind of, it was so good, it could even take what I know is a very controversial and polarizing Spider-Man story and make it great without the proper context at the time of me first reading it of what was so bad about the original Clone Saga. But then for Sal, who had kind of read through that and gone through the original storyline originally, and then one of the big things that pulled him back into reading Spider-Man after 3 or 4 years away was Ultimate Spider-Man. That must, seeing Bendis and Bagley do that story justice in the way that he never got originally, felt like such a vindication for him. They felt like it could have been deja vu. It could have all come crashing down again. The Clone Saga could have drove him away from comics again, and yet it didn't. And he talks about in the video how much that's one of his favorite things Bendis has written. That's his favorite part of Ultimate Spider-Man because of how it overcame and how it's recontextualized what was a very negative experience of his readership. And a book that kind of drove him away from comics now being something he really celebrates. So that is a video I'm really proud of. I think it's a very special video. And I'm really glad that you brought it up.
Awesome. So we got to move on from one big major comic important creator in the 2000s to another one in the 2010s. I'm talking about Scott Snyder and Grant Capullo. I got to say, if there was two creative teams, Bendis and Bagley were the 2000s defining one. I got to say Snyder and Capullo were the defining creative team of the 2010s. So one of my favorite videos is how Scott Snyder redefined Batman and New 52 Retrospective. You have the stories Zero Year, which was featured recently in the Batman, Matt Reeves' Batman with Robert Pattinson and Zoe Saldana. But you also have Riddler gets his justice as well. You have Joker in the most horrifying range that he's seen in years. You have not only that, the disassembling of the Bat family, and then also the reunification of the Batman family. How Jim Gordon became one of the biggest, stepped up in the superheroics. One of Alfred's final, I've sad to say, this last major storylines before Tom King he met his maker in Bane. Spoiler alert, sorry. And not only that, weaponizing the Justice League like that, and also creating the Court of Owls, which now has had a major stay in major media, such as like video games and also some of the TV series. So and not to mention, Scott and Craig are amazing creators because I had the opportunity to meet them at New York Comic Cons in Kansas City and Planet Comic Con Kansas City. They're amazing. So I'm so happy that you pointed out how Scott Snyder rekindled Batman for a new generation.
Yeah, so Snyder and Capullo's take on Batman and the run on Batman is probably my favorite Batman run of all time. Honestly, I think every issue of it, all 51 issues of it, are amazing. I know the final stretch with like the Jim Gordon Batman is not as well kind of talked about as like Court of Owls, Endgame, Death of the Family, that era. But I even love that. I think that was so much fun and so cool. And I get why people don't like it. It feels wrong, but it's meant to feel wrong. Jim shouldn't be Batman, but he is because he's a good person. And he's a great hero, and he's the person that knows Batman best and has worked with him the longest of anyone. So I even like Super Heavy. But yes, I love Scott Snyder. Scott is one of my favorite writers of the last kind of 10 or 15 years. I think that a lot of the work he's been doing at DC has been absolutely incredible. And his take on Batman especially is a book that really opened my eyes in a lot of ways. Batman's a character that fortunately has had like so many incredible runs by so many different writers. Scott takes over from Grant Morrison, who had wrote Batman for the previous 8 years and also had done an incredible run as well. So Batman was in a good place when Snyder and Capullo took over, but I really think they took it to another level.
I totally
in any
agree
issue to stop.
because it's very, like you mentioned, it's very hard to follow Grant Morrison. You cannot
Mm.
follow them justice. We'll get to Morrison later
Exactly.
we'll get to Morrison with his team books. However, if it's individual characters, it is Batman that he has helped that Grant Morrison has helped define, and it's artwork like Tony Daniels that has art that has defined Batman. So Greg Capullo had a lot to live up to, especially when it came to Tony's art, but he knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Morrison had done such a huge, like, monolithic Batman run, beginning with stuff like R.I.P., which is one of my favorite Batman stories, all the way to like Batman's death in Final Crisis, Battle for the Cowl, the whole like Dick Grayson Batman era, which I think is amazing, and also it's kind of my introduction to Scott Snyder with Black Mirror, but then also all of the Batman Incorporated stuff as well. Like Morrison had done such this massive Batman run, which redefined the mythos in so many ways. And then Scott Snyder is kind of forced to step in, and how do you follow that up? How do you how do you continue the kind of the goodwill and the success that legendary comic book writer that someone like Grant Morrison had done? And yet I think that Snyder, it's a more kind of back to basics approach than Morrison had done with Batman. Morrison was very interested in expanding the Bat mythos and, putting other people behind the cowl and turning Batman into more of a concept and an idea more than kind of an individual, which I think is cool. Snyder's is kind of a bit more rooted in the idea of Bruce Wayne himself and the personal relationships between Bruce and the characters closely associated with Batman. But I think that New 52 run is so good. I think Court of Owls is, as just a standalone kind of 6-issue series, the perfect way to introduce any reader to Batman. I don't think there's a better story that you can just jump straight into and learn about Batman, about the Bat family, about Gotham. And you don't need to know a super amount because with it being like the first Batman series of the New 52, it sets up everything you need to know from the very beginning. You learn who Bruce is, you learn who all the Robins are and everyone in the Bat family, and the brand new villains. So you don't need to find out who are the Court of Owls, because no one knew who the Court of Owls were. You find out throughout the story. So I think I think that is kind of the crown jewel of their work, and I think it's the best thing Scott's ever written. But then to go from that to stuff like Death of the Family and Endgame, which I think are two, I kind of very much view them as one story in two parts, like as the last kind of hurrah of the Batman Joker rivalry. I think they're incredible. I think Snyder has somehow managed to give us two very unique versions of the Joker, unlike anything we'd seen before, but also two of the best Jokers. I think the Death of the Family Joker with kind of like the cut off face is one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen.
That
But
same
then
here.
the Joker we get,
That horrified
yeah.
me as well because Owen, I actually was lucky enough to be at one of the free things. So I had both Scott sign a Joker, sign it. It was Detective Comics #1, the relaunch, and I had both
Mm.
Tony Daniel and Scott Snyder sign it because I'd said Scott was like, well, "I didn't write this book," but I'm like, "I'm sorry that you are the one that made the Joker the great."
Yeah.
Joker cut his
That's
face off.
under
So
his kind of like,
yeah,
absolutely. And it's like, and like Death of the Family is an awesome story. It's such like a love letter to like the original, like 70, like the like Silver Age Batman Joker stories, like the 60s and 70s. But while like putting a very like new perspective on them. But then I think Endgame, when the Joker comes back and it's the whole like this idea of the Joker being this immortal creature, I think that's such a fascinating story, and I think everyone gets like so fixated on like the subplot of the Joker like predating Gotham and thinking of this as like this big retcon that kind of ruins the character. But I think just as a story of like the Joker seeking revenge on Batman, the way I talked about it in the video is like, if Death of the Family is the Joker's attempt to win back Batman's love, believing that he's too preoccupied with other villains and the Bat family, that the Joker's not as important in his status quo. If Death of the Family is a Joker kind of insanely driven by love, Endgame presents as a Joker exclusively driven by hate, who's been rejected by Batman, has been pushed away, and all the kind of flamboyant and over the top of nature of the Joker is stripped away from him. He pretty much dresses in black the entire time. It's a very kind of subdued, visually version of the Joker, and yet I think it's one of the most chilling and horrifying takes on the Joker we've ever seen.
I know, and
And then like,
and here's the sad part, because for me is I always read Batman in Kevin Conroy's voice and Joker and Mark
oh,
Hamill's voice.
absolutely.
And it's so sad that we're not going to be able to see an animation or audio adaptation of those stories, because it's been chilling to see Mark Hamill. If you thought Killing Joker was
Yeah,
Hamill's terrifying at his best, and same with Arkham Joker, I have a feeling if Mark Hamill got his voice on the Joker on Scott's Joker, it's game over.
absolutely. It's one of my favorite takes on the Joker. Both of those books are. I think that it's such an incredible way of presenting the Joker, especially going from like Morrison's Joker in things like Batman R.I.P. to Scott Snyder's Joker, to both versions of Snyder's Joker. That's three wildly different takes on that character, all within like 5 or 6 years, that are all equally feel like the Joker and all equally incredible. I think it's so clever. And then, yeah, like you talked about 0 Year earlier as kind of a major source of influence for Matt Reeves's Batman, and definitely as someone who loves that series so much, as soon as I started seeing that seawall get blown up at the end of that movie, I was like, yes, let's do 0 Year. 0 Year is really cool because, and especially I think it's the most interesting part of that video for me, is because when I was reading it originally, that was the part of Snyder and Capullo's Batman I was the least into. Probably just because I am such a big fan of Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli's Year One. The idea of anyone kind of replacing that with a new origin story just seemed like sacrilege to me. And it was only like when I went back and when I was rereading the entire run for this video, I stumbled upon an interview with Snyder where they talked about how they approached writing 0 Year. And he basically said that I knew I could never do a better version of Year One than Miller did. I could never do a short, condensed, dark, gritty, realistic origin story for Batman better than Batman Year One. So instead, I'm going to do the opposite choice to everything Miller and Mazzucchelli did. Year One is 4 issues. 0 Year is going to be a year-long saga. Year One is a very grounded street level story. Okay, mine's going to become like a blockbuster epic movie. You know what I mean? Year One is going to be very muted in terms of its color palette. 0 Year is going to be this kind of almost neon and technicolor Batman event. And so it's like reading it from that perspective is and hearing how much Snyder has this love and reverence for Year One, and basically wanted to do the inverse and see if it would still work as a Batman story while keeping the kind of thematic core of that story, but tonally and stylistically doing the complete opposite. It not only gave me a newfound respect for Scott as a writer, but it gave me immense respect for Greg Capullo as an artist, because I think he is one of, if not the definitive Batman artist, specifically of kind of the modern era. And I don't think he ever did any better work on Batman than in 0 Year. It's the way he adapts like so many like famous bits of iconography from previous Batman stories. The way he incorporates the pinks and the yellows and the reds of the color palette, while also making it still feel quintessentially Batman, is just incredible. So the entire run as a whole, like rereading the whole thing, I really love what Snyder and Capullo did. It's one of my favorite, like I said, it's my favorite Batman run. So many stories in it are some of my favorite Batman stories, and getting to present that in a video was so much fun.
And I gotta say that throughout the entire New 52 line, it was probably that book, along with Jeff Johns' Justice League, and Jeff Johns' Green Lantern, and probably Gail Simone's Batgirl, were, in my opinion, the glue, and Jeff Jones' Aquaman. I forgot to throw that in there. It's those books were the foundation, really were the most consistent parts of New 52. And unfortunately, and I gotta say, your second most viewed channel video on your channel is the rise and fall of the New 52. And I think you've done a brilliant job. And it must not have been such an easy task going through all of New 52, because that's way too, because there's been some duds, there were some fantastic stories, but at the same time, it felt like so bleak.
Yeah, so the New 52 is a concept in a time period of DC that I've always been immensely fascinated with, because it's a period of massive extremes. You know, as a whole, as an initiative and as an era of DC, it's quite often looked at as a failure. It's looked as a period of DC that didn't work. You know, Rebirth comes in 4 or 5 years later and kind of like softens and undoes a lot of the major status quo changes and continuity changes of the New 52. But at the same time, there's so many awesome books that come out of that period. You know, we talked about Snyder and Capullo's Batman, and I very much think that is kind of like the crown jewel of the New 52. But like you said, Gail Simone's run on Batgirl is awesome. There's an amazing Batwoman series that comes out at the start of the New 52 as well. John's Justice League series is really great as well. The Aquaman, the backups they did for Shazam in Justice League were awesome. I'm not massively high on New 52 Superman as a whole, but I think there are a couple of really awesome Superman stories that come out of it. Morrison does that kind of brief run on Action Comics to launch it. And then when you get into like the Greg Pak Superman run later on in the New 52, when they do the whole story of him being depowered and becoming a bit more of a street level hero, I eat that up completely. So the New 52 is like has a very curious legacy. And I think that like the ramifications of it are still very much being, and I think DC still today is trying to make sense of everything they did in that era. And so chronicling it in a video was a really difficult thing because, like you said, it's one thing like doing the Scott Snyder Greg Capullo video is massive because I'm looking at 52 issues of a writer and an artist telling a story, and not only the kind of individual stories they tell as storylines and events within that, but also the overarching story of that run. That's a massive task to do in itself. Now apply that to doing that, but 51 other books at the same time is an incredibly daunting and monumental big task to do. And the thing I was really interested in with that was there's a lot of good New 52 books and there's a lot of not so good New 52 books. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. But why as a whole is it looked at so negatively? And the conclusions that I kind of came to was not so much on the individual stories, more on how it was handled from an editorial standpoint. The idea is that it was a very last minute change that DC made, that prior to the beginning of Flashpoint, DC weren't really planning on doing this massive continuity reset. And it was only like as they were doing the Flashpoint saga that they realized there was an opportunity here to use that as a jumping on point for a reboot. They kind of rushed into it. So you get things where like Snyder and Capullo didn't have to change that much taking over from Morrison and what they'd done on Batman for the New 52. I know obviously Batman and Green Lantern were the two books that kind of didn't have their entire continuity changed as much as, like, say, Superman, for example. But then there's other books like what Morrison did with Action Comics that I think are really hurt by the editorial situation. I think Grant's idea of like trying to chronicle like the 85-year history of Superman in a continuity sense and present him an introduction, like when we first meet Superman as like an origin story, being very much like the 1930s, like working class everyman Superman, who is less powerful, but is more kind of dealing with social issues of the day, things like, you know, corrupt businessmen, landlords, politicians. That's the kind of bread and butter of like those early Siegel and Schuster Superman stuff before it gets into all of the fantastical and the sci-fi. And I like the idea that Morrison wanted to start Superman off with that and then build him up into the Superman that we all know and love. The way that in real life did he evolved from decade to decade. And I think that as an idea, as an approach for Superman is fascinating. But then the way in which DC editorial was running things, the things they wanted to do, kind of made that impossible to do at the time. And I think that's a massive misfortune. And that's kind of the consensus I came to with the New 52, was that there's a lot of good and bad, but the main issue with it was there wasn't a long-term plan for it. Writers didn't know kind of what was canon and what wasn't canon, what they could do and what they couldn't do. It just didn't seem like the structure and the framework to allow these creatives to succeed was really there. And I think part of that probably comes from how last minute it was as a concept to do this reboot, that if maybe they had a year in advance to properly flesh and plan it out, it maybe would have gone better. But I think it's an interesting topic because I think DC is still trying to learn from its failings today while still kind of carrying on with its successes.
I totally agree. Oh, and I just want to I forgot to mention two series that really made a big impact. I got to talk about Brian, briefly give a shout out to Brian Azzarello and Cliff Chang and their team over at Wonder Woman. They did a fantastic job rejuvenating a lot of people's interest with Wonder Woman. And not to mention Jimmy Palmiotti and Amanda Connor and Chad Hardin take on Harley Quinn.
Yeah. That's the thing. Like, there is a lot of good stuff to come out of the New 52. And like I said, I know that we talk about it kind of casually as a very negative thing, but so many people's favorite versions of those characters do come from the New 52. And not only that, like the amount of people I've spoke to, either like people that watch that video or other videos in passing, or people that I kind of speak to on social media, the amount of people that tell me that like their first introduction to comics and to properly reading comics was through the New 52 kind of does make it a success by that nature. That even if that kind of era of DC didn't last as long as they would have hoped, that was so many people's like beginnings into reading comics in a broad sense. So I do think it is something that has a legacy that we kind of should reevaluate. And I'm glad that I was able to kind of present that and kind of put my 2 cents on the topic.
Awesome. So speaking of new interest with comics, we got to go back to the House of Ideas with Marvel and how Brian Michael Bendis saved the Avengers. I got to say, I think was it 7 or 8 years of storytelling for Bendis?
Yeah, about that.
Yeah, so I gotta say, he did so much to that franchise because because no one could touch what Kurt Busiek and George Press did after that legendary run. And then, but like to make Scarlet Witch one of the greatest villain threats, that's their own version of Dark Phoenix. And then not only that, bring in Spider-Man full time, bring in Wolverine, bring in Luke Cage, redeem Jessica, villainize and then redeem Jessica Drew because of the Skrull invasion. And not only that, bring in people like Doctor Strange or Echo, heroes that would never have joined the Avengers into that book.
Yeah.
So I gotta say, kudos to you on that new Avengers stuff.
Thank you. Like I said, New Avengers is a book that I have like a lot of personal reference to as well. I kind of came into reading like main Marvel stuff towards the very tail end of the Perez and Busiek era, so I didn't really have a proper appreciation for that at the time. Obviously, going reading it back nowadays, it's a phenomenal Avengers series, and especially knowing the context of how rough the Avengers comics of the 90s were and kind of where they were at before they took over. They did such a good job of kind of putting the Avengers back on the map. But for me, Bendis's take on the New Avengers is still probably my favorite version of that team. Like I said, the first like real Avengers story I properly read was Disassembled, which is a wild like introduction to the Avengers when it's just seeing them die and seeing them distressed and seeing the team break up. But then out of that comes New Avengers, and like Ultimate Spider-Man was was my favorite book at the time, and so I was kind of just like religiously following Bendis and be like, right, you are my kind of guide and gateway into this world of Marvel. So, like, you made me love Spider-Man, so if you're writing the Avengers, I'll probably love the Avengers. And the New Avengers is so cool because it's so like, I think it's so antithetical to what makes like Busiek and Perez's Avengers interesting, and yet they both work. And in a lot of ways, I think something I know you want to touch on a little bit. I think there's a really interesting comparison piece between how Bendis kind of relaunches the Avengers in New Avengers and how someone like Grant Morrison relaunches the Justice League in JLA. I think it's a very similar approach, but also a very different approach at the same time. The Avengers now are like the biggest thing in the world. Kids as small as like this big know who Iron Man is and the Falcon and the Vision. Whereas like when I was younger, the Avengers were kind of the place where characters who couldn't sell their own books went. And so when Bendis comes in and is like, why is Spider-Man not in the Avengers? Put Spider-Man on the Avengers. Why is Wolverine not on the Avengers? Puts Wolverine on the Avengers. I love that book. I love the origin story, the breakout saga, with all the villains escaping from the Max. I think is great. My favorite part of that, and one of the thing I remember reading at the time that like really like blew me away was the introduction of the Sentry, who is still to this day one of my favorite comic book characters ever. But I'd never read the original Paul Jenkins Jay Lee Sentry series from like 2000, 2001. So when he's introduced in New Avengers, that just blew my mind because it was such
Seeing
a
him rip out Carnage was absolutely, and David Fincher's art at the time, seeing the Sentry come back and rip Carnage off of the entire world and kill him was like, wow.
Yeah, the way that Bendis uses the Sentry throughout that entire run is so cool. I remember, like, in the first issue in which he shows up, there's that bit where he's hiding out in a cave somewhere, and the Avengers and Shield go and basically track him down, and he explains his origin, that he kind of like, and it's the origin that like Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee give him, that he was this like amazing superhero from the Silver Age who made the world forget he existed because of the Void. And then the twist that Bendis adds when they bring Paul Jenkins into the comic, and he's like an in-universe comic book character. That he's a writer for Marvel Comics in the Marvel universe, and the Sentry is a fictional character. Is like the Superman of the Marvel universe in terms of like a fictional character. Just like I'd never seen anything like fourth wall breaking or anything really like meta in a comic book in that sense. Like now I've read a lot of Grant Morrison and Alan Moore books. I'm very used to that kind of approach to storytelling. You know, now when I think if I'd read Grant Morrison's Animal Man at that age, and how that book ends with kind of an ideological argument between Animal Man and Grant Morrison, my brain would have melted. Same with something like Alan Moore's Miracle Man, which the Sentry very much is kind of a tribute to. And so that entire New Avengers run, pretty much from Disassembled to like House of M and Civil War, I think it's one of my favorite periods of Marvel writing. And I think it's one of Bendis's best periods as well. And the fact that Bendis was writing that and Ultimate Spider-Man at the same time, and both of like the best kind of periods of both titles come at the same time is such a high testament to like the level Bendis was working at in like the early to mid 2000s, that he was writing multiple like era and genre defining, generational defining comics.
Absolutely. And got to mention that New Avengers pushed people to push all the major events that I told you about: Civil War, Siege, Secret Invasion, and not mention putting Norman Osborn, raising Norman Osborn's that level from not just Spider-Man, but the entire Marvel Universe. And not to mention making the Skrulls more terrifying than ever before, and bringing back characters like Mockingbird, and not to mention, and eventually the Wasp too.
Yeah,
Y'all thought we're lost.
it is, and it's interesting because of how much that run changes as well. Like the early, like pre-House of M New Avengers is a more kind of stripped back and grounded take on the characters. It's a more street level version of the Avengers, which is what I found really interesting about it because of how different it was to kind of Buscema and Perez's version. But then, like, once you get into Civil War and you get the split of the original New Avengers and you go into things like Secret Invasion, Siege, Dark Reign, the way that book kind of constantly changes and evolves, both in terms of like the superheroes featured in it, but also like the tone and the world of Marvel at that time and how it changes. Bendis is so, and I know like he's kind of like the main creative force at Marvel in that period. But the way he like evolves the title with so many major status quo changes and keeps it interesting is such a testament.
Yeah, I gotta say that final lineup that Bendis did before Heroes, before the heroic age of Bucky Barnes Cap, of Luke Cage and Jewel, and the real Jessica Drew, and Miss Marvel, and and Wolverine, and Peter Parker.
Absolutely.
That is, and Hawkeye. That is probably one of the most amazing lineups I have seen in years.
It is, and it's so good because Bendis does such a great job of balancing like classic Avengers mainstays like Captain America, like Iron Man, like Hawkeye, while also like promoting like obscure and lesser known characters to the forefront. Like Luke Cage is like one of the mainstays of the New Avengers. He is kind of like one of the real leaders of that team. You know, we have Echo on the Avengers, we have the Sentry, we have Spider-Woman. It's such an interesting with Jessica Drew. We have so many like characters that you would never put together on the same page, that would never really interact and really be involved in stories together. And the way Bendis kind of brings them all together and makes it work is so cool, in my opinion.
I totally agree, 100%. We got to talk about one before we move on to Grant Morrison. We got to talk about Secret Wars 2015, because that was, in my humble opinion, the last great Marvel major event that I picked up, because it's Jonathan Hickman at his best. It is not only you see, and also it's also, like you said earlier, a love letter to the Fantastic Four and to Doctor Doom, and see how
Yeah.
without them changes the whole world. And not only that, you see so many incredible moments from that thing, from Cyclops' sacrifice as the Phoenix to like Mr. Fantastic, to Miles and Peter officially teaming up since the first time
Mm.
since the Spider-Man story.
Yeah. It's the 2015 Secret Wars is, I agree with you. I think it's definitely the best Marvel event book. And I think a conversation could be had that it might be the best event comic of either of the big two. I think for me, it's between that, Crisis on Infinite Earths, and Final Crisis. I think they're the three that I'm like, there's no wrong answer between those three of what you think the best event is. And the fact that Hickman could tell a story that's on the level of something like a Crisis on Infinite Earths or a Final Crisis is such an achievement. We talked a lot about kind of writers that define generations. We talked about Bendis being kind of like the writer that defines Marvel in the early to mid 2000s. Scott Snyder being one of the writers who defined DC in the 2010s. I think if you had to pick a writer that defines Marvel in the 2010s, it's Jonathan Hickman. I think that everything they did, whether it's like the run they did on the Ultimates, to the Fantastic Four and Future Foundation series, to Avengers, New Avengers, and then into Secret Wars. One, the fact that that's all like one 12-year long story that runs throughout 4 or 5 different titles. But then Secret Wars itself as an event is one of... I've never had so much fun reading an event book as when I read Secret Wars. I was picking up, not only because I was like anxiously waiting for every issue of the main series, but all of the tie-ins were outstanding. There were so many great books that came out of that. And it was such an interesting kind of field to play in so many different ways. I like I said, we talked about the Ultimate Spider-Man. I'm someone that has a big kind of love and reverence for the Ultimate Universe. So, like you said, seeing Peter and Miles together was awesome. Seeing Reed Richards and the Maker on the same side working together was fascinating to me. Not only because of like how different Ultimate Reed was to kind of 616 Reed, but also how similar Ultimate Reed is to Doctor Doom in a lot of ways. And seeing kind of the dichotomy between those three characters and how it comes down to those three characters at the end is perfect. I'm someone who loves the Fantastic Four. They are one of my favorite superhero books of all time. I think they're the most important superhero team, property, whatever, ever created. And I think that they're definitely the most kind of underappreciated in a modern sense. And at the time that Secret Wars was being told, Hickman had done that big run, which I think is phenomenal. But then after that, you have the whole thing with Marvel, like canceling the Fantastic Four's books and kind of suppressing them because of the film rights situation. And it's like Hickman, despite the fact that they'd moved on and they were doing this like epic run on Avengers and New Avengers and building to Secret Wars, managed to tell this story that like caps off the end of the Marvel universe. And the way I phrase it in the video is like the Marvel universe as like an interconnected world began with the first introduction of the Fantastic Four in 1960. When Lee and Kirby brought the Fantastic Four in, that was like the dawn of the Marvel universe. And Hickman is doing the end of the Marvel universe and the beginning of a new era for the Marvel universe after it. But Secret Wars is very much seen as like the end of that 50-year saga. And I think it's so poetic, despite the fact that like Reed Richards isn't the biggest Marvel character anymore. The fact that the two characters that both decide the beginning and the end of the Marvel universe are Reed Richards and Doctor Doom, like the original hero and the original villain that like define that universe. And I think it's my favorite portrayal of Reed. I think that Reed gets a bad rap from a lot of people. There's this kind of perception of Reed as a bit of like a detached, emotionless husband and father, that he's kind of more interested in his work and his science than he's not a particularly loving guy. I've always kind of not thought that's true. I think Reed is an incredibly empathetic, compassionate, and emotional man who struggles between that battle of heart versus head, like a lot of kind of geniuses and creatives do. But I think that Secret Wars is a story all pretty much dominated and driven by Reed's humanity and his compassion. And that's ultimately what separates him from Doctor Doom, is the fact that like Doom can't imagine putting other people before himself. So even when he does good, which he undisputedly does when he saves the universe and creates Battleworld, but he does it in a very self-serving way. He'll save everyone else, but he's then kind of the first to get what he wants out of it. Whereas Reed, Doom creates Battleworld and he's God Emperor. He scrubs Reed from existence and everyone kind of lives worshipping him. At the end of Secret Wars, Reed creates the universe and is just he's barely even in it. He goes off with Sue and the kids to kind of remake the multiverse. It's like Doom. That's what I love about how Hickman kind of presents how similar and how different those two characters are. And it's ultimately what makes me love Secret Wars so much, is it's like Doom can't handle not being the center of attention in any story he's in, which is a very on-brand characterization for Doctor Doom in anything, that he always has to be the most important character. And he sees himself as the most important character. Whereas for Reed Richards, he has all the power in the universe at the end of that story. He is the most powerful man. He can remake reality however he wants. And all he wants to do is just be a dad, be a husband, and be a scientist. He's not interested in ruling the world. He's not even interested in being kind of like the most beloved superhero in the world. He just wants to be a father, a husband, and an explorer. And I think like that's such a perfect way of encapsulating the differences between those two characters. And it's such a great tribute. And it's, Alex said, at a time when the Fantastic Four were kind of being pushed to the side, Hickman kind of reminding us of not only like how fascinating and incredible these characters are, but how important they are to the history of Marvel as well. And I love that book so much. I really, really do.
Absolutely. Secret Wars definitely is up there with the greatest modern day storytelling. Well, take 12 years to tell that story is just absolutely amazing. And speaking of stories,
Well, that's
one final story that we got to talk about are two franchises that were looked upon, frowned upon, or maybe like not underutilized, and how one man changed everything for both franchises. I'm talking about the one and only Grant Morrison, and the two teams I'm talking about are two of the biggest teams in comics history. In fact, probably two outside of Fantastic Four for Marvel, the X-Men are another very important franchise, and for DC, it's their flagship. It's Justice League. So we're talking about JLA and new X-Men, two important storylines for the late 90s and early 2000s for JLA, and new X-Men for 2000. So those videos that you made for both of them were phenomenal. There are so many incredible moments. For JLA, it's Joker holding the Philosopher's Stone and going out of control. And also the superheroes banding together to stop Mageddon. It's also the formation of Prometheus invading the Watchtower, not once, but twice, and Oracle taking him on head on. And not to mention the renovation of Zazala, the Queen Bee, on Justice League. For new X-Men, seeing the horrifying number of those evil Sentinels that Cassandra Nova can mention, wipe out Genosha. Not to mention Emma Frost becoming one of the greatest villains, going from one of the greatest and villains to anti-heroes to one of the core leaders of the X-Men. Seeing Zornito really wipe out New York. The sad depart, and also one of the most heartbreaking kills of Jean Grey.
Yeah.
Those are all
two.
One man has created epic, and not to mention Howard Porter, Ethan Van Sciver, all of those, Phil Jimenez, all those incredible creators that he worked with, to cultivate those two universes.
Definitely. So I'll start with JLA. We'll kind of go in terms of like the timeline in which both books happened. So I'll start talking about JLA. I love that book so much. It's my favorite version of Justice League. I think still is Keith Giffen and James DeMatteis' Justice League International from the mid-80s. It's a very different take on the Justice League. It's very silly. It's very lighthearted. But I love that book so much. It's one of my favorite long-running series of all time. But I think the JLA is the best take on the kind of more classical Avengers I've ever read. Hands down. It is like, the whole idea of like DC's heroes representing kind of mythological figures and gods, I don't think has ever been encapsulated better than in JLA. And there's so much I love about it. I love how Morrison writes the Justice League. I love the kind of I love the choice of characters that's in it. Although it's the original 7 members from the original 1960s JLA, the way it uses legacy heroes is so cool to me as well, because it's kind of there's a generational gap in the Justice League, and I love how the older and the younger members interact. You've got like the Trinity and Aquaman being like the older statesmen of the team, but then you've also got the Flash in this series is Wally West. Green Lantern in this series is Kyle Rayner, and then a few kind of stories later on, you get Connor Hawke joining the team as Green Arrow as well, and you have like 3 or 4 more seasoned, experienced elder statesman heroes fighting alongside a younger generation of heroes. And I think that the similarities and differences between those characters and the ideology of that is really interesting. I think that one of my favorite things about JLA is I love like the first 6-issue saga with the Hyper Clan. I think that's great. And then straight after that is when DC in the Superman series make the change to go with Electric Blue Superman, which is one of the silliest creative decisions ever made. And so I spoke about this on Twitter recently because I was thinking about it. The end of issue 5, like the original like New World Order Hyperclan story ends. Superman has the long hair mullet, but like the classic blue and red costume. Issue 6 starts, Superman shows up to the Watchtower and is just blue. And Grant never takes the time to explain why. Never addresses why Superman is now like looks like Electro from the Amazing Spider-Man 2. But only like you can tell that Grant was kind of like it was an editorial mandate that they had to use the current Superman. I don't think they planned out to use Electric Blue Superman throughout JLA. And yet, despite that, I love the way Grant writes Superman in this series and uses the Electric Blue Superman's power set in such cool ways. It's a situation where like I don't think it's what they planned to do, but it works out for the best. I think there's so many great stories from this run. I think, like you said, the original kind of Hyperclan saga is awesome. The Prometheus stories, the when Prometheus kind of just show like the first time when he infiltrates the Watchtower and takes down each member one by one is so cool. Like it's almost like a horror book, just seeing this guy like a home invasion kind of like horror of this like incredibly capable assassin able to take down, pick apart, and like splinter each member of the Justice League one by one. They really make Prometheus feel like a massive Justice League level threat in a way that I don't think any writer since has really been able to capture that in the same way. But then you get things like you get Rock of Ages, which I think is one of the greatest Justice League stories of all time. Not only is it kind of the most important in terms of like the modern portrayal of Darkseid, I think pretty much every Darkseid story that's come since is borrowing from how Grant presents them in Rock of Ages. And there's so many like even in terms of things like the Zack Snyder movies, like their like dystopian future where like Darkseid's invaded the Earth and Superman's evil and all this stuff is like clearly borrowing from like the dystopian future from Rock of Ages. And the same with like some of the animated movies, like the Apocalypse War film that they did a few years ago. That concept seems to be like a recurring thing that all circles back to Grant's JLA one. And like you said, the big kind of final story where they fight Mageddon, and it's like this like massive fleet and army, like the Justice League lead the entire world into battle, is such an epic conclusion. It's such a fun run, and I think that like as much as I want to praise Grant Morrison's writing for the series because I think it's one of their best works, like Grant is known as being one of the greatest comic book writers of all time. Grant gets a lot of love for a lot of books. The big like criminal thing about JLA for me is the fact that like Howard Porter didn't go on to become like a massive artist, because I think the way he draws the Justice League is incredible in this series. I love his art in JLA. I think he's I think he's the perfect guy to like couple Morrison's writing and depict the Justice League as this like incredible pantheon of gods. And it completely blows my mind that coming out of that, he didn't go on to be like a household name in terms of comic artists. But like how Grant reinvented the JLA and took them from a place where like, the Justice League weren't really doing well after the end of Justice League International. You think of like Death of Superman era, the Justice League are fodder for Doomsday in one issue. He punches Blue Beetle into space. Like they're not an obstacle, they're not a threat, and they're not to be taken seriously. And so the way Morrison kind of reinvents them and brings them back and puts them back on that pedestal, and they've never really left. Like since JLA ended, and like Mark Waid took over afterwards, does Tower of Babel, has an incredible run, and then like into the 2000s and the 2010s, the Justice League have stayed the biggest and the best that DC has to offer, and a lot of that has to do with Morrison and Porter. So Morrison does that once and then decides they're going to do it twice. So then they hop over to Marvel and do it again with X-Men. And obviously, like, X-Men's a slightly different scenario because like Chris Claremont had wrote the book for it was like 20 years at that point. And then they'd left in 92. You have like the 90s era of X-Men, but that peters out quite quickly. Like the late 90s is a really rough time for X-Men. Like after like post Age of Apocalypse, it's not great, especially like as Marvel's going through the bankruptcy stuff. The X-Men kind of falls apart a little bit.
I gotta give you a little defend here because I gotta say I love the lineup of Storm, Wolverine, Gambit, Rogue, Marrow, Kitty Pryde, Nightcrawler, and Colossus. That was one of my all-time favorite lineups. And with the Magneto War too, and also with the 100 stuff, those are great. Yeah. And I admit that like the death, like Mystique's final revenge in Dream's End, and then not to mention the death of Colossus at near the end, and then Eve of Destruction, which features Magneto as most powerful yet. Yeah, those were some good moments, but like I totally understand.
Absolutely. Definitely, but I think by like 2000, I think it was very clear that the X-Men needed a reinvention, and obviously they try and bring Claremont back briefly in 2000, and that doesn't seem to do it. And so the way I phrased it in the video is basically they tried to bring Claremont back to try and recapture the magic of the previous X-Men run. But Claremont had been out of comics for 8 to 9 years at that point, and I feel like as great as Claremont's X-Men is, because they wrote the series for so long, there wasn't much else for Chris Claremont to do by the time that they left. They kind of finished writing X-Men at a natural point where they'd taken the X-Men as far as they could, and it was now time for other people to do things with it. And so instead of bringing Claremont back, Marvel needed someone new to do to X-Men in 2000 what Chris Claremont did to the X-Men in the 1970s. And that just happens to be Grant Morrison. And it's funny because Morrison's X-Men wasn't like my gateway into X-Men, like the first X-Men series I read was like the tail end of Morrison, and then really the Joss Whedon Astonishing X-Men was like the first X-Men series I properly read, and that's a good run. Like I think Astonishing, like controversies with Whedon aside, is a very good run and a very good introduction to the X-Men. But in hindsight, it does kind of remove a lot of the interesting things that Morrison does in terms of like evolving the mythos of the X-Men in their series. I think that like you talk about that kind of first story with Cassandra Nova, with the destruction of Genosha and the mutant genocide, is such like a moving and powerful change to the mutant status quo. Not only like how it evolves the place of mutants in society, but how it evolves Charles Xavier and the X-Men as well. I love the way that it's funny because I know at the time, like especially with like all of the movies and stuff, people have kind of gone against, have kind of turned on the idea of the uniforms and the X-Men being this kind of paramilitary force. Whereas I think in new X-Men, like I love the black and yellow jumpsuits. I love them being presented more as like a military force than a superhero team. And I think that like taking them that next step further and kind of in a bit more serious direction is really, really interesting. I think that the only downside I think with new X-Men is whereas JLA kind of had very consistent, it was Morrison and Porter pretty much from beginning to end, with like a few kind of fill-in issues here and there. One of the issues I have with new X-Men, just from a reader's perspective, is the constant changes in artwork. It's never like you could be reading one trade and issue to issue, it'll switch from Frank Quietly to EVS to someone else, and it does kind of break the immersion a little bit. While I think all of the artists that work on the series are good, it doesn't have a kind of uniform look in the same way something like JLA would. But I think in terms of like plotting the course for the future of the X-Men, New X-Men does such a great job. That first, I talk about this in the video, and I talk about this to death to anyone that asks me. The very first page of New X-Men 121, the first issue of Morrison's run, the first page is with the decapitated Sentinel and Cyclops like shooting at it and Wolverines. And there's a little mutant kind of hiding underneath like the Sentinel. Wolverine's like sliced its head off, and Cyclops is lasering at it. And the only dialogue in the scene is Cyclops saying, "Wolverine, you can probably stop now." And it's such a great metaphor and such a great way of saying like this is a very familiar scene. We've seen the X-Men working together to defeat Sentinels time and time again. And then Cyclops is saying, "You can probably stop doing that now," which is a very meta way of Grant saying, "Here's a scene you're very familiar with. It's been in countless X-Men stories. Now we've shown you it. Say goodbye to it because we're going to do something else, and we're going to do something you've never seen before." And I think that, like, yeah, for better or for worse, because there's some odd choices in New X-Men. I think that the Zorn stuff I'm still not sure how I feel about it. I can't work out whether it's incredible and hilarious or ridiculous. And the idea that Magneto just kind of poses as an exchange student in Xavier's school for like years in order to get revenge. I can't work out whether I like that or not. I think I do. I think it's incredibly silly and fun, which above all else is kind of what Grant wants superheroes to be. But then you get into stuff like the Cassandra Nova, Charles Xavier stuff, the death of Jean Grey at the end of the run, and even the little time travel epilogue story that they threw in, which is something I completely forgot about until I made the video. There's so many powerful moments from that series. I think that one of my favorite things about it, I'm just kind of rambling at this point, is its use of Emma Frost. Emma Frost kind of becomes the protagonist of the X-Men and kind of not only becomes like the de facto team leader, but he's kind of like the main character of the series for a good chunk of time. And like her relationship with Cyclops is quite polarizing because it's kind of love triangle with Jean Grey. But I think the way that Emma and Scott evolve as people and as leaders by the end of the series, especially like the really gut-wrenching scene of the two of them after Jean's death, sets the X-Men up for like years and years of great storytelling. I think that like Whedon carries that on in a way. But then I think as well, like I dipped out of the X-Men for a few years after things like after House of M and after Decimation. I kind of like tuned out of the X-Men. And then I really came back into reading X-Men with Hickman. I was a massive Hickman fan, loved Fantastic Four, loved Secret Wars, loved Avengers. And then when House of X happened, that like rekindled my love of X-Men. And one of the most interesting things about that, despite the fact that I'd missed like 10 years of X-Men story, I'd kind of all of the stuff with like the time displaced original 5 members is still a bit of a blind spot of mine that I need to go back and fill in. But I love the fact that like, and there's a monologue that Xavier gives in House of X, and I can't remember the specifics, but basically Xavier chronicles like all of the important history of the X-Men, from like the founding to Xavier having to build the second team to go into Krakoa and rescue them, which is the giant size story, into the Dark Phoenix saga, and so on and so forth, the Age of Apocalypse, and it ends with the destruction of Genosha. And it very much feels like, although it's 15 years apart, what Hickman was doing with X-Men in terms of like evolving them from being like an oppressed minority, living in a world that doesn't, and living in a society that doesn't accept them, to becoming kind of separatist and forming their own culture and becoming their own religion and nation state and peoples, is in a way a continuation of what Grant was doing in kind of the idea of creating mutant subcultures, mutant fashion, mutant having like M-Town, like areas of New York that were primarily housed by mutants. And that kind of, in a way, it kind of does evolve the metaphor of Claremont's X-Men, of the X-Men being a kind of oppressed minority, whether that be people of color, people of different kind of credences, religions, sexes. I think Morrison updates that in a very 21st century way, in a way that there's still kind of the scaremongering of kind of minorities that, you know, never goes away, but also the way in which they create their own cultures and their own kind of fashion and language is a very interesting thing. And I think that Hickman takes that and runs with it. And I think that what makes me love Hickman's run so much, not only is just in itself, but how it's a great continuation of New X-Men. I'm rambling at this point. Please stop me. I'm just talking.
Alrighty. I'll be happy to do that, but I think you've brilliantly done that. And besides, there's so many themes from Morrison's X-Men are being used today. You have Beast becoming the villain of Here Comes That we saw at Here Comes Tomorrow. That in the pages of Wolverine and in X-Force. You have Jean Grey back in the life, and you have Emma Frost being one of the de facto rulers of leaders of the Silent Council, and you have so much stuff going on with that. So I gotta say, Grant Morrison did a fabulous job. But we got to talk about the current state of comics before we wrap things up, because right now DC, I am not, to be clear, everyone, I have not picked up a single title since Doomsday Clock ended back in 2021. So, or through Jokers have ended 2021. So I've been keeping up with stories on internet sites and everything. But right now, DC and Marvel look a little bleak. What is your take on it?
So I'm in a similar position to you, where like I'm a little bit out of sync with the current goings on. I haven't read any of the big event DC was doing, the Dark Crisis stuff. I haven't really read any of that. I know Marvel's been doing some stuff as well. I'm a little bit behind with current comics by kind of the nature of what I do. I tend to be a few years behind everyone else. The most recent book I actually finished reading this yesterday was Morrison's Superman and the Authority series. I finally got around to reading that. I thought that was really interesting. And like I said, I've been a bit out of touch with Superman for the last couple of years. I haven't, I would like to keep up, because I do like Tom Taylor as a writer. I would like to kind of keep up more with the current goings on with Superman, especially with John. I think that's a really cool, from what I see and what I hear, that seems like a really cool run. But in terms of like Clark Kent Superman stuff, I haven't really been reading Action Comics. So I've heard very good things about the War World saga that had been going on in there, but I just haven't. I will get to it eventually, but I just haven't yet. And so, as has probably become apparent throughout the past hour of this conversation, huge Grant Morrison fan. Superman and the Authority is like the final Superman story. They're kind of taking a break away from comics now. And it also is like the setup for this War World stuff going on in Action Comics. So I finally yesterday sat down and read all 4 issues, and it's great. I love it. I never thought a Superman costume with short sleeves and without a cape would work, but it's so cool. I love it as like a thematic continuation of things like All Star, which is my favorite comic book of all time. And of what Grant did in JLA and what Grant did in the New 52. Superman and the Authority is like the final epilogue of that Superman, where he is older and his powers are pretty much gone, and he has to rely on his brain and his heart, and leads a team of people that can kind of make up the heavy lifting physically for him, while he is kind of more of like a Charles Xavier type character, as like a strategist and a leader and like a father figure.
And also not to mention Bruce. It sounds like Bruce as well.
Well, it does in a lot of ways. He's kind of taking Bruce's role in teams like the Justice League and the Outsiders and the Bat Family. It's a really cool series, and it's drawn by Mikel Janin, who is one of my favorite artists in comics right now. I fell in love with him throughout the Tom King Batman series. I really, anything he draws, I will read. And I think that him and Morrison teamed up great on Superman. But that's probably the most recent thing I've really been reading. Like I said, because I tend to, like I said, I don't want to spoil the new video too much, but it is a 90s DC comic. So I'm kind of knee deep in DC in like the years between like 1993 and 1997. So I'm just going to like stay there and check out what's going on, I guess.
Awesome.
Is Batman still Jean-Paul Valley? I'll read and find out. Superman have his mullet yet? Who knows?
You got a lot of stuff to catch up on, my friend, and I will give you a list when we get off camera on stories that you need to catch up on with the Bat family.
No, absolutely. There is a lot of there's so much like modern stuff I need to kind of catch up on, and that's the beauty of it, because I'm always like going back and filling in holes of things that I hadn't read from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, even earlier than that, sometimes 50s and 60s stuff. Because I'm always plugging in those gaps, so I can just seem like a encyclopedic knowledge of old comics online. It also means there's always more books in the present day that I can get to and read. The stuff I've been catching up recently is a lot of Tom King's more recent works. Big fan of Tom King. Mr. Miracle, his Mr. Miracle series is one of my favorites. I finally got round to reading Rorschach, Strange Adventures. I've just started on Human Target. So that's the kind of that and Superman and the Authority are like my current comics on my pile to read.
Awesome. So, my friend, we gotta start winding down this conversation. This was an epic one. So, where can my audience find you on social media, and and also, what's the channel?
Yes, so if you enjoyed listening to me ramble about comics for the past hour or so, you can find me over at youtube.com/Owen Likes Comics. I make analytical, historical video essays looking at the behind the scenes stories of comic book characters and superhero media. So comics themselves, I'll tell you, I'll explain the story, not only of the comic itself, but also how it was created, what its legacy and impact has been. But I also dive into things like superhero movies, animation, and other things related to that as well. It's a fun time. You can also find me on Twitter, just at Owen Likes Comics, and most other, because, by the time this podcast comes out, Twitter might have exploded into a million pieces. You can find me on most other forms of social media as well, just at Owen Likes Comics.
Awesome, guys. So if you missed an episode of the Jake's Take with Jacob Elyachar podcast, head to our channels on Apple Podcasts, Deezer, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Podcast Addict, Spotify, and Spreaker. It's Jake's Take with Jacob Elyachar, JACOBELYACHAR. Are you on social media? Because I'm on social media too. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Jacob Elyachar, JACOBELYACHAR. And Owen, in August, jakestake.com is turning 12 years old.
Wow.
So if you want my take on articles and interviews, what's going on in America's Got Talent, The Masked Singer, and some of my takes on some of my favorite comic book stories, visit jakes-chick.com. Check it out. Owen, thank you so much for taking a lengthy amount of time with me. I really appreciate it. I truly enjoy talking with you about all things comics, modern day comics.
Absolutely, definitely. Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun, and hopefully we can do it again soon.
Absolutely, yes. So, guys, thank you so much for listening to this. Thank you so much for watching us. Until next time, have a good one, everybody. Goodbye.